are asked not to become agnostics, of course. Having said this, my opening address is now coming to a close. On behalf of the Ludwig Maximilian Universität Munich and my chair of Indo-European and Historical Linguistics, it's with great pleasure that I wish you, us and you all a very successful roundtable discussion here, and thus also promoting and recommending our various disciplines. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor, Mr. Professor, Mr. Hackstein, for your welcome address and for your explanation about old languages. New approaches to language study using mathematical methods have paved the way for research projects like the one recently published in the American journal Science, which forms the basis for our roundtable today. We are pleased to welcome Professor Paul Hegarty, lead author of the scientific article in question and senior researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology. Professor Hegarty will present the results of his research with a particular focus on the Albanian language. Professor Hegarty, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to Albania, despite how little I know of Albania and Albanian. You will see my limitations in this, but I ran this big project. Can we make it full screen, please? I was running this big project on a whole Indo-European level. You see the languages on there. Those are the languages in our database. So I'll be giving about 15 minutes introduction to this research, because there's a lot of misconceptions, I suppose, about it. It's not standard linguistics. It's a fairly new approach to using language data, and it uses only some language data. It's a new methodology, so I'm going to try and explain some of the common misconceptions about it, and then I will switch to the particular place of Albanian in our database and in our results. So this is just the title of the paper, and you can see all the authors there. I'll show you a bit more detail in a minute on the authors and who we are. And that's the one-page summary with that graphic, which you will also be coming back to, but with a tree of Indo-European languages and with Albanian in an interesting position, let's say. So this is, yeah. When this appeared in Science, there was a news article within Science itself, and I quite liked the title and the line they took, which was that a new language database narrows the search for the first speakers of Indo-European. I like it firstly because the database was a huge amount of work, and we have several of the contributors for Albanian. Two of them are here. It took us many years. You can see those dots of all the languages we covered. We had 80+ linguists, contributors, specialists in these languages. So the database is still there, and it's a resource we hope other people will use. But in this particular phylogenetic analysis, which I'll explain, they have given this title, narrows the search for the first speakers of Indo-European. It doesn't say we have provided the definitive answer. In fact, among the authors, the 33 authors on this paper, not everybody is completely convinced by this new linguistic methodology. So it narrows the search. It's not the definitive answer, and it's certainly not the definitive single date. That's not our result anyway, as I'll come to. So Indo-European being this huge language family, it's a pleasure actually to come to a country where everybody really knows what Indo-European is and they know where their language comes from. I can't give this talk in many countries where I can just assume everybody has heard of Indo-European. In the UK, if I give this talk to a university audience, I would have to explain, oh, by the way, do you know that English is a Germanic language? It doesn't come from Latin or French or anything, and it's part of this big family. I can skip a lot of that. I'm going to assume people know what Indo-European, what the language family is. And here's some of the press coverage, because, of course, Spanish belongs to this family, German belongs to this family. And this as the... it's a shame we can't really see the title of some of my slides. I don't know if that can be moved. The title there is older than we thought. It's the journalist who wrote that article in El País. He said, so your basic message is that the Indo-European language family is older than we thought. And I said, I suppose, yes, you could say that because we're talking about the family. Now, we've already just heard about the danger of the word old, and it's a big problem. I don't talk about a language being old. I talk about the family. You can try and put a date on an event in this language family. Normally what we're trying to put a date on is the origin, the beginnings of significant divergence within a language lineage. Indo-European language lineage existed before Proto-Indo-European. There was pre-Proto-Indo-European. Proto-Indo-European is really the last point at which there was enough unity. And then some geographical expansion happens. And when the same language originally is in different areas, it's going to be changing all the time. But once those areas, it's spoken in geographically distant places, the people who speak it are no longer in frequent contact. Now the changes don't need to be the same in different areas. So fundamentally, what we're trying to track here is at what point can we start saying, okay, the geographical divergence that we see today started at a particular point in time when the expansion geographically started. That's about, it's somewhat idealized in any case, but that's what we're trying to date. And if you look on the top of that peak, that is, you see the tree is very fuzzy. That's our real result. If you do Bayesian probabilistic analyses, you don't get a single tree. In fact, the beauty of these methods is because you don't need a single tree to get at least a distribution of most likely trees. So nobody on the project is saying we have the true tree of Indo-European. In fact, we're saying it doesn't look like there's a single, simple, clear tree, okay? Different language data support different trees, and it's why Indo-European linguists have been debating for 200 years exactly what the structure of the Indo-European tree is. Some bits are very clear. We know that there's an Albanian branch. We know that there's a Celtic branch. We know that there's a Slavic branch and a Baltic branch. Other bits are less clear in how those branches separated out from each other a long time ago, deep in prehistory. So we can talk about, when we're talking about what's the date, what's the age of the Indo-European family, all we can really say is, when do we think this family started spreading significantly geographically, which then ended up creating, allowing the same original language to change differently in different regions so that you get this divergence. One of the key things I also want to say on this slide is that, so the key question is, we're using language change. If language didn't change, we wouldn't be able to do any of this. Languages always change, and we're trying to use language change as a way of measuring doing a chronology for the separation of those branches. Now, what we're not doing is the old technique from the 1950s called lexicostatistics, and then there was an addition to that, which was called glottochronology. Glottochronology, a lot of people think, well, that's trying to get a chronology from languages, so that's what you're doing. Well, glottochronology has a very specific name for a very specific approach to doing that, which we do not do. We would never do it. None of us believe in glottochronology. It was more or less abandoned about 40 years ago. We do a different thing. We do not, so what we have is we don't have what they used to call a glotto clock. We don't assume that languages change at the same rate through time. In fact, we know from our data, it's all over our data, they do not. Everybody knows now and has known for decades that languages change at very different rates in different parts of the languages, and at different stages in time. They can change more quickly or more slowly, depending on lots of factors. So we don't use that. The only thing we use to date are the dates of known historical languages. So things like Latin, Mycenaean Greek, ancient Greek, classical Greek, Gothic, any of the languages that we have a fairly good idea of when they were dated, those are the points in the tree that don't reach the end here. Okay, so where there are branches that stop, that's because we have an old language, we have records of an old language that allowed us to put that language in the data set. So that's where the time calibrations come from. And we don't tell the method that languages change at a certain speed. We let the method tell us how fast they're changing in all of the different parts of the tree. So that's a basic summary. Here is Albanian, the gray dots. There are 3 of them, the coverage we have so far, at least, done by 2 of our colleagues here. And who'll be speaking later anyway, so they'll be able to tell you much more about the actual Albanian data. That's the place of Albanian in ICOR, and I was amused really to see the place that, ICOR ended up having in Albania. I was taken aback almost. I should have known, given the importance of language in Albania and in Albanian culture, but it came as a big surprise to me. I was very happy. I mean, never has there been more interest in an article I have written, okay, and certainly in a countrywide level. So I suddenly started realizing, oh, actually, this is more important than I realized for some parts of the world. So yeah, Albanian, the IE core results, it's right at the top. I'm going to give you a zoom in, but it's interesting that its branch goes deep. Okay, that is certainly, there's the zoom in. So Albanian is the gray one here. You can see it, and it seems to go back very deep in the tree. And it's, yeah, you can see how fuzzy this is. What that means is we don't have the data do not point in a very clear way to any other particular branch as particularly closely related. Now, I'll come to the details later on towards the end of the talk when I switch back to Albanian. One other thing I want to show, which is not in the published results, but this is just something I did myself. This would have been an old lexicostatistical study. We don't do this in our analysis, but this is to show, this is a sort of heat map of how similar all the languages are, again, with all the others. And so the main branches you see that are blocks of languages are highly similar to each other. So Celtic, Germanic, Slavic, and so on. This white line right across the top or down here, that white line is Albanian. And so it's very interesting what that means. It's the one that's most different in many ways to all the other branches, which we'll come back to. But so which is the oldest language is a question I constantly got asked, particularly by journalists from Albania. And my answers were more or less the same. I basically said, well, all languages change and languages do not have a date of birth. You can't say a language was born on a particular day. That's what, when we consider ages of people, we talk about their birth date. Well, we don't have a birth date for a language. We can have split dates for a language lineage, but they're not the same thing, as we'll see. And I compare it to, this is a nice tree of cat species, actually. And so you could look at all those cat species and say, well, which of those is the oldest cat? And it's a complete confusion. Well, the cat might grow, get older and die, but we're not, that's what we mean by the oldest cat. If we mean which is the oldest species of cat, it doesn't really make much sense because they all come from a proto-cat. So they all have the same ultimate ancestor at the same point in time, and they're all modern branches. So it sort of gives a lie to saying how old is a language. We need to talk about lineages, and we can talk about how long ago certain lineages split from each other. And the other thing which is also quite dangerous and can be open to abuse is that languages or language lineages can reach different places at different times. Okay, and that is a key part of the history of and the arguments in the Balkans. But that's about a language lineage. It's not necessarily about a language. I'm just going to give a few almost personal anecdotes of how I got into this project and what it's about. So it's based on language change because we couldn't do this without languages changing. And the fundamental question here is how fast do languages change, or how slow do they change, and can we use that? How regularly do they change, if at all? And the reason I ended up getting into this whole field, I hadn't decided whether to do linguistics or archaeology, but I was not too far away from here in Transylvania, and that's where I decided, wow, this is so cool, I want to be a historical linguist. And I read this line, "In patria nostra multe silve sunt," and it's deliberately chosen as the first line. Actually, it's the Latin equivalent. "In patria nostra multe silve sunt" was the first lesson that Romanian school children had to learn when they were being taught or indoctrinated in the fact that, as everyone knows, Romanian is a Romance language that comes from Latin. But what's interesting there is how little this phrase, this one, has changed since Latin. You can even play around in another Romance language, Romance just meaning spoken in the Roman manner. So there's Romania. These are the related languages within the Romance subfamily, let's say. You could even get away with "En nuestra patria muchas selvas son." It's not exactly how you would say it, but you can see what we call the cognates, which are the basis of our analysis, which words come from the same origin. So that's one of the reasons I got into linguistics. And then when I was at school, I'd done a lot of Latin, but I was encouraged, I was almost duped into doing Greek as well as an extra subject in my lunch breaks, because, well, you've done Latin. It's so similar. It will be so easy. Don't worry. And well, yes, these sorts of things are fairly similar, although there's an article in Greek which isn't there in Latin, and the word endings are a bit similar, but basically I soon found it's not that similar. Okay, so this question of how similar is Greek and Latin really, how old is that relationship, how deep in time does that go, was also part of what got me into this whole study. I've also been working for a long time making recordings of the four main branches of Indo-European in Europe. There's a site called Sound Comparisons. So I've been working a lot on phonetics. I actually want to add Albanian. It's not in there. If you want to visit Sound Comparisons for looking at the huge diversity in how fast languages change in sound, you can get some examples there. Anyway, back to Indo-European. It's a very big question. It's a big question because it occupies in space. It occupies at least, even before European expansion, it was spoken from Iceland to what's now Bangladesh. It occupies a big period of time. Even on a short chronology, it would be more or less at least 6,000 years old. On our results, it's about 8,000 years of spread and divergence. So that occupies a large chunk of the Holocene. And in demography, it's now about the native language lineage of about half the world's population. So it's a big question. What's interesting is that actually most of the hypotheses on where and when it started have come from archaeologists, not from linguists, which is an interesting perspective anyway. I would just stress again, one of the misconceptions is that we're talking about an archaeological culture corresponding to a language family. That's very simplistic. Languages can change. Languages can spread demographically, or they can spread by people culturally, by people switching language. So they can, the relationship between language and archaeological cultures is indirect at best. And one of the things that Colin Renfrew, who was the lead author of the farming hypothesis, he would always stress it's a new field of archaeology that came in, well, around his time, processualism. And the point is that we can't say, okay, a language family matches a particular archaeological culture. What we can say is we think in terms of processes. And so one of the processes, a big process that impacted on humanity, was the rise of agriculture and the spread of agriculture. It's not the only one, but it's a significant process. And it leads to we see an expansion in the archaeological record. And we can also now track population expansions in ancient DNA, and a language family exists because of an expansion. If it hadn't expanded geographically, we wouldn't get a diverse language family. So that's really, I would work through trying to identify in the archaeological, linguistic, and genetic records the same process that was affecting people. I wouldn't try to do, we'll also see there is no one-to-one link between languages and genetics. And the problem is, of course, that there are many processes that can lead to cultural and/or population expansions through time. And there are technological expansions, there are cultural expansions, there are different types of subsistence system. So here I'm just going to try and summarize the two hypotheses where we're really going to be focusing on, which is the steppe hypothesis and the farming hypothesis. And they're different. There are three levels, basically, the questions of where, when, and why. So where, different homeland for the family proposed, when, a different time depth, so older in the farming hypothesis, younger in the steppe hypothesis, and a different answer to the why question, of why did this language family spread when so many others didn't? Either it was because of the demographic expansion with farming. Farming can support many more people per square kilometer than hunting and gathering can, or it was to do with pastoralism on the steppes, and particularly the domestication of the horse and greater mobility thanks to inventions like the wheel. So we have these two opposing hypotheses, opposing on all three levels of where, when, and why. And this is relevant because we've seen these maps. This would be then the steppe hypothesis, everything from around 6,000, even maybe slightly later years ago, an origin on the steppe and an expansion in all directions. The Renfrew's farming hypothesis, an origin with early farming in the northern Fertile Crescent. There are different language lineages spoken by first farmers, almost certainly in the Fertile Crescent, as we know, things like Sumerian. But the idea is that one of those could have been Proto-Indo-European, and that would be its expansion route. Notably, a difference, for example, in how languages get to India, either through the steppe or in Central Asia, or directly through Iran and into India that way. And what we have in our figure, in our result, and you can see also on our program here, we have what we call a hybrid hypothesis of how parts of both hypotheses seem to be supported by our results. I actually would favor a southern route, various reasons, also archaeological and even ancient DNA, but we left it a bit open on the insistence of a reviewer. One thing I would like to say here is that the steppe hypothesis is not really a done deal. Not for me. I came from historical linguistics. I don't believe that that it has already been demonstrated. A lot of people do. That's sort of common, widespread thinking among many Indo-Europeanists, is that we already know it came from the steppe. I don't know if that's changing. I think we have in our paper, you see their supplement at the bottom. Obviously, we know about these arguments, why it has been proposed that Indo-European must have originated in the steppe. I am not convinced by any of those. There's an article of mine arguing against that. I just think we don't know yet with certainty, and that's why I wanted to do this analysis. I will also point out, this is a comment, an e-letter on our article that came out recently, and it accuses us of what they call archaeolinguistic anachronisms. For example, the fact that gold, this is linguistic paleontology, a methodology I really don't have much confidence in. And the idea was that, well, we've got a word for gold, the sort of Oro, Spanish Oro root, or in French, and it goes back to a point, it only goes back to around this time depth, whereas the languages that have it in our tree go back a few centuries earlier. So we've made an archaeolinguistic anachronism. And my response to that is, I think the anachronism is completely on the wrong side, because humans have never lived in a world without gold. Gold can be found in its native state. The same applies to silver, actually. Humans have never lived anywhere where there wasn't gold. So the fact that in Varnaman, they find a burial with lots of gold, and that's the first archaeological evidence, is irrelevant. Humans have always lived in a world with gold. So whether we have a word for gold at which point in our tree is not going to tell us anything. So I think there are dangers in using this methodology, and I actually see flaws with all of these, which is why I have an open take on whether it was the steppe or not. As for how fast languages change, this is a tree by Don Ringe. We've already heard his name mentioned, a distinguished Indo-Europeanist, who did a form of phylogenetic analysis, which gave him this tree. These are all the earliest languages in each branch, basically. And the biggest difference between his result and ours is this big green band. So these languages we know when they were spoken, these ancient languages, and Ringe has a tree that more or less has them all branching relatively quickly. And it's that period, so going back to about 6,000, it's that period that for us is much longer. Another way of looking at this is if this figure, it's only in our supplement, and you need to be taken with great care because it looks like we've got the true tree, and we're not saying this. This is actually the least bad tree, but it's a bad tree. Most of those branches, the earlier ones, don't actually exist, okay? It's just if you tell the program, just give me one tree, it will try and give you the least bad. And this is the least bad, but it's pretty bad, okay? So I'll come back to that later, but the main point is the length of these individual branches. So the individual branch to Proto-Celtic, to Proto-Germanic, to Proto-Slavic, or Proto-Balto-Slavic is very long. It's much longer. It's a few millennia, whereas Ringe doesn't do a chronology here. He's just assuming on the basis of an assumed steppe hypothesis date. And he just draws all the branches together very quickly. That's not what our quantitative approach would suggest. Dating from language change, again, I'm dubious about this. I'm dubious about the claims that, yes, but the old Indo-European languages, the ones we have, Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, they're so similar that it can't have been a long period of divergence. I was never very convinced by that. I've already told you about my formative experience having encountered Greek, having started from Latin. And the main problem is languages change at such variable rates. Okay, so Lithuanian is famous for its case endings at look like they haven't changed much in millennia. Well, if they haven't changed much in 6 millennia, then maybe they haven't changed in 8 millennia. It doesn't really give us a fixed way of arguing. Meanwhile, if you look at French, I just have these, my favorite Latin words that you could now, to try to pronounce those in French. The first one is o, the next one is o, altum is o, ad illum, to become an article with a preposition in front, it's actually o, or the plural is also o. So all of those words, aquam, ossa, altum, ad illum, ad illos, they all are now pronounced o in the space of 2,000 years. French phonetically underwent incredibly rapid change, a whole system change in its sound system. But actually, in our results, in turnover in cognates, which is what we use, I'm going to explain that in a minute, it's a fairly normal Romance language. So different parts of language change at rapidly different times as well. So, okay, how do we date from language? What sort of linguistic clock can we use? The old technique would be to use numbers, glottochronology, lexical statistics. You just count how many, you take a list of 100 or 200 meanings, you look at the words in those and you see which of those words are related. So let's say weiß and white, weiß in German, white in English, that's a related shared origin, that's a match, but black and schwarz have a different origin. So weiß and white are cognates, black and schwarz are not cognate. That's all that term really means. And you can count them, and throw those numbers into very simple, it's really lexical statistics. You get a number, okay, English and German, 73%, something like that. Throw all those languages in, and very, very simplistic mathematical ways, almost by comparison anyway, to produce a tree from that. Or you can assume that languages change at the same rate, which was the idea of glottochronology, but it doesn't work. And you get, you know, as I said, 30, 40 years ago, glottochronology was already discounted. What we do is something completely different. We don't use these numbers, okay? People say it's mathematical. It is in a way, but we don't use those counts. We don't use lexical statistics. And we also have, in this presentation, there's no history, there's no time dimension. We do have a time dimension, and we do a modeling. I'm going to show you a bit more detail how we do it. I'm going to start then through the whole process, and this is what our Albanian specialist did, and all the specialists for all the languages. Here are 3 meanings, 5 finger and hand, in 11 languages, in European languages. So we take the words for that meaning. We can also phonetically transcribe them, get a bit more standardized, so we can start doing our linguistic analyses. These analyses have been done for centuries. This is not new, but I'll show you what we do that's new. Then you can start grouping together those words according to their origin. So the first 2, for finger, we have finger and finger, okay? And then here we have dito and doigt in Italian and French, dedo in Spanish. So obviously, finger and dito do not come from the same origin. You do your linguistics properly, and you can work out where they come from. In the case of Latin, it's easy. Others, it's a bit more complicated. We have to reconstruct. But we get to patterns. You can't really see the colors so well on this. We get to patterns in which languages do or do not share a related term. And then you can see, so you define that term by its origin. So in this case, Proto-Germanic fingra, and then Latin digitus, probably the accusative really, but anyway, you can group those together. And this is where you can make a switch. You switch to what's called a multi-state datum. Now we know, we used all the linguistic information, the data, the transcriptions, what we know about morphology. We use that to identify which words are related to each other, but then that's just a fact, a relationship between languages, and it's represented, so you can call that a multi-state datum. And so we have different types of origin for the finger words. We have A, B, C, D, E, F, and G among these languages. Actually, all the words for 5 are A. They all come from the same Proto-European root. And then this is another key step in the methodology. You can ask questions about it as well. You can binarize those. You can change from a multi-state A, B, C, D, E to, do you have A, yes or no, 1 or 0? Do you have B, 1 or 0? Do you have C? So in this one, finger, we have 1 and 1 in English and 0 in all the others. Whereas for the digitus root, you have a 1 in the Romance languages, but 0 in the others. And the reason we do this is because the best phylogenetic methods around use 1s and 0s. For mathematical reasons, ease of calculation, and these things they can take days to run the analyses, and they need a very efficient mathematical way of doing it. And it's based on ones and zeros. I'll show you in a minute. Unfortunately, you can't really see very clearly there. What this tree is, it's just a toy example, but you put the 1 or the 0 with the language at the top, and you start off, and you have to start off with a 0 or a 1. And at some points in the branching structure, a 0 has to change to a 1, or a 1 has to change to a 0. So these are changes. So either basically at some point, English switched from a Germanic root. In many cases, it borrowed a French word from Norman French, a mountain, for example. And so the Germanic word goes from being present to absent, 1 to 0, and the mountain word goes from 0 to 1. So we get changes, and this is how the method works. It's got this branching structure, which it creates anyway, without knowing anything, a random branching structure. And then it looks for all of the different patterns in 1s and 0s in all the different languages, and it tries to create a tree where 1s are changing to 0s and 0s are changing to 1s. And it's changes that are actually fundamental. It sees how many changes you need effectively to get from one language to another. And to result in all of the 1s and 0s we have in all of the modern languages, you have to track all the branches along which certain changes may have happened. Now, and then, of course, you've got your old languages, so you can pin the chronology on this. You don't assume any changes are happening at a particular rate. That comes out of the results, actually, of the calculations. I'm not going to spend any more time on that. You can ask me if you wish. If you do, we can go back to the questions. If you do this, then the date of Proto-Indo-European is, well, Booker et al. In 2012 did a paper in Science, and they said, well, it's about 8,400 years. And then they found a mistake in their data set and said, oh, actually, no, it's 7,600. And then Chang et al. Took the same data set, did a different analysis slightly on the same data set, and said, no, it's 6,500 years. It's a step hypothesis after all. And I was tasked with looking into what happened here. And I immediately found crazy results like this. In the tree, this is the Booker et al. Tree. Ancient Greek is supposed to split from the ancestor of modern Greek about 4,400 years ago. This is a howler, an absolute howler. And, you're surprised these things get published, really. But there are howlers in the other one as well. These people don't look into the details enough. So that date, obviously that's nonsense. We've got 4,000 years of branch length that should not be there. This is what's dangerous about these. What I put down in ICOR with our new results, we actually get a split date of about 438, more or less just before ancient Greek. So it's pretty much right. In the Chang et al. Paper, they also have weird results. They use what they call ancestry constraints, but then they get a result that said that within Romance, after Latin, nothing changed. There was zero divergence across the whole of the former Roman Empire for 1,000 years. And then suddenly in 1000 AD, the Romance family starts happening, which doesn't work either. And I know exactly why that happened, and it's for the same reason of bad data plus ancestry constraints. So what we got a date of beginnings of divergence at 162, which is actually fairly accurate. Again, here's the example of Icelandic, Faroese, and Norwegian is supposed to be identical until 1650 or so in Chang et al.'s results. Obviously historically wrong. We get about 920. So that seems to be validating that we get some things right. How we did that, this is just very briefly, we had a big data problem. The previous data sets were very inconsistent because they allowed synonyms in ways that were too dangerous when you do binary analysis. This is ICOR, and that's how we fixed a lot of the data problems. So if you want to come visit the website, that's the address, and you can see the language data. I would have shown it, but I can't. It's too complicated to do it on a website from here. It's cognate relationships. Now, I want to stress, that's all it is. We do a lot of, obviously, we do our phonological analyses, morphological analyses to work out what's cognate. But other than that, that's not in the database. So you might want to do this again on completely different sorts of data that linguists traditionally use, sound changes and morphology. The problem with those data is they're not good. It's hard to do a change in time on those for reasons I can also explain if you get time. Anyway, there are the summary data for the data set. We have almost 26,000 individual words and about 5,000 cognate sets. We needed a completely new methodology for that. I think I'll just go through this because we're going to get talks on on the methodology before. These things have been done before, but as we saw in those two previous papers, the results were so poor because of bad data, it really needed a completely new methodology and being done, again, much more strictly. These are the two other key people in the database, Cormac Anderson, who sort of ran the whole organization, emailed far more people than I did, and that's Matthew Scarborough, who did the work of coding cognacy at the Indo-European level. So he did more or less 2 or 3 years and about 2,000 references to standard reference works in Indo-European. These are people who are not linguists, they're phylogeneticists who are on the team at different stages. Results, that's our basic result. We fixed those problems in the earlier analyses. We get very interesting results, particularly the sort of surprise was how different and how deep the relationship between the Indic and Iranic branches are. But anyway, that's our distribution of most likely dates, and we get a central estimate of 8,120. But I mean, that's not very precise, as you see. That goes from about 7,500 to about 9,000, that distribution. We didn't do the direct answer force thing. Again, I'll come, you can ask questions on that. The one thing I do want to stress is that if you see a split in that tree, it is not a language event. Languages do not have a date of birth. Okay, if you go back, if you look in this tree, you will see things like European Portuguese and Brazilian Portuguese, and they're different branches. They have to be. There are a few, 2 or 3 lexical differences in our list. But you can't show any lexical difference unless you have different branches. They're basically varieties. Okay, so we have 3 Albanian varieties, whether it's 1 language or 2 languages, we can debate. But the point is, don't think that there's some mythical absolute concept of a language or 2 languages or 3 languages, and that's what we're doing. We're not. They start off as, in fact, in the program, they start off before there's any difference. The program has to have 2 branches in order to start saying, well, now we've got different branches, we can have different changes on each branch. But so the splits are not, they're dialects, they're sub-varieties. If you take a list for 2 different language varieties, my English and American English, there's at least 1, possibly 2 differences that you would use. Okay, so they wouldn't be different languages, but they'd be different branches. Okay, so that's important again to understand what's going on here. So if you see a split in our tree, that doesn't mean it's the date of birth of Albanian. Doesn't mean it's the date of birth of any language. This is our real result, for example, for the Slavic branch. That's our least bad single tree, but we don't really like it because we know that lots of the support values for those are less than 50%, and that Slavic probably was some form of dialect continuum which broke up geographically, but the split is not 100% neat. There are also cases where our tree, because our tree is only about cognates, it's not about phonology, we have differences between our tree and what you would expect on standard classification. We'll see the case for Albanian, actually. We get it for parts of German. We get it particularly where languages remain in contact in dialect continua. But don't expect, and don't say our tree is wrong. Most of the time, I had a lot of these, I went, oh God, this tree doesn't look right. And I looked into the tree and looked into the data because it didn't look right because I know my sound changes that are supposed to give us the other tree or the morphological changes. And then I looked at the data, I went through all of it. Do you know what? Actually, for these language data, for these cognate data, the tree is correct. The method reproduces a tree that fits with the cognate data. The cognate data don't necessarily fit with the phonological data. So that's really quite important. A big general conclusion before I now shortly move on to Albanian is that there was a radiocarbon revolution in archaeology when radiocarbon came along, and suddenly the assumptions about chronology that archaeologists have been working with for decades turned out to be wrong in many cases. They got things a bit wrong, and they had this cascading change of dating for a lot of their cultures. And it was called the radiocarbon revolution. There's actually been a series of radiocarbon revolutions, but the first one was the big one. And that's what I think we might need to do in Indo-European and in linguistics in general, because a lot of dating impressions are based on it taking Indo-European as 6,000 years old. Certainly we get it for Celtic, older than thought, and we certainly get it for Indo-Iranic, much older than was previously thought. I'm going to say a bit about ancient DNA. Some of these figures don't look right there was the 2015 paper by Hark et al. Hark is one of our authors. He's an ancient DNA specialist. And about movement from the steppe into corded ware Europe. They've actually got a later paper which shows that it's actually more complicated, and there seem to be two different movements from different parts of the steppe, or even what they call the forest steppe, which is really a large chunk of northern Russia, which isn't really steppe. So things are getting a bit more complicated. This paper recently just come out online where they are reaffirming that the founding population of the first farmers and then pastoralists on the steppe actually came about 7,000 years ago from somewhere here in the northern Fertile Crescent. That fits in with this other recent paper, even from the Harvard group, where they have this movement. Ignore that one, that's much later. The original one, they call it Proto-Indo-Anatolians down here, and then a movement up here to what they call the Proto-Indo-Europeans on the steppe. But the key thing is, if it came from the steppe, it must have a lot of red, should be about half red on the steppe, and there's very little red in parts of the Balkans, particularly in Mycenaean Greek, and there's none in Anatolia. So that's why the geneticists in Harvard in this paper are basically saying, okay, there's a movement onto the steppe, and it started out south of the Caucasus, and Anatolian languages are not involved. But all the other branches, according to them, do come from that. But it's more or less a Pandora's box. Once you say that actually Proto-Indo-European was down here, or certainly what they call Proto-Indo-European and Indo-Anatolian, then the question is, okay, some of them came through the steppe, but which? Did all of them accept Anatolian, or did all of them accept Anatolian and a few other exceptions? So for Albanian, the question is, was Albanian going also from south of the Caucasus, or did it go through the steppe? Here's one last genetic, just to say that this is from Hark et al. Modern populations, okay? And you see that modern Indo-European populations are diverse genetically, okay? These three different major components. So there are big differences between Indo-European speakers in their genetic profile. This is India, actually, where you see that there's no orange and there's hardly any orange and no blue, but there's a lot of a different component. The last one is actually a Dravidian language, an Indian non-Indo-European, and it's full of that. So that looks to be a sort of Indian profile. And the remaining one among all the Indo-European speakers is this big one, this big green one. Now that green one is present in all of Europe, but it's not the one that was originally on the steppe. It's the one that was originally south of the Caucasus. Now, there's a lot of ancient DNA analysis you might want to do. Our summary figure, what we've tried to do is put the major DNA movements in ancient DNA and the relevant archaeological cultures that have been proposed as candidates alongside our chronology. So we're more or less trying to link them through chronology and also through how many splits arise when. So really we say it's a hybrid hypothesis on multiple levels, also because the way that pastoralism got started on the steppe was actually because farming came from the Fertile Crescent to get the pastoralism started anyway. So there's sort of primary expansion and a secondary expansion. So it's a hybrid on all three where, when, and why questions. Anyway, to close in on Albanian, we have two of our three Albanian language specialists here already, so they can talk about the data and how difficult it may well have been in Albanian. You wouldn't assume it's going to be easy to work out cognacy states for Albanian against many ancient languages. If you want to see the website, you can go to the Albanian data, you can go to the website, you can choose in this box, you can choose all three, you just hold down Shift, I think, and you can select all three. You can even use direct URLs to go to the Albanian data on our website if you want to see them. This is actually the data, a different site, it's not public, but we used it for entering our data to create the database. And what I've shown here is, so you can choose two languages. I've put standard Albanian and English. And there's an interesting number you can hardly see, I think it's 7.6%. That would be a lexico statistic, okay? What I've done here is I've just told, okay, only show me the words, the meanings in which English and Albanian still have a cognate. And we only get 7.6% of our list are still deep cognates. And we have a list that is these are very stable meanings where we needed it to focus on those meanings to try and get a signal back deep in time, and we only get 7.6% of shared Indo-European cognates between English and Albanian. So this is what this bar means. This bar means that actually Albanian is the language with the average lowest shared cognacy rate with all other languages in the family. Okay. Now, one of the reasons for that is because Albanian is a very early branch. It's not quite so simple because here we're comparing languages of different periods. So if you see these dark lines, those are italic languages. They're old languages, so they haven't had as much time to change. So obviously, they're more similar to all the other languages. So you get the reason Albanian looks whiter than Anatolian and Tocharian is just because Anatolian and Tocharian are ancient languages and their change stopped. So they've still got more cognates. The reason Albanian looks so white is because it's a modern language and it's had another few millennia to change. So this is why lexicostatistics doesn't really work, because you haven't got a clear time dimension. So we don't use that, but it's an interesting that Albanian comes out as that white line. What is different about Albanian, again, you can hardly see it. If your eyes are better than mine, you probably can. What you can do with these results is you can take this least bad tree and ask, okay, how fast are things changing? And it gives you a rate of change. And the figure for Albanian is 0.0066, which is relatively high. Okay, so that's in the fastest range of how fast branches are changing. So we've got a lot of ones changing to zeros and zeros changing to ones, more on the Albanian branch than in many of the other deep branches. Then it slows down a bit within the modern period. But this is an overall figure. And it's not how the thing is calculated. It's just, as you can see, the rates vary massively. So it's not using this to work out its dates. It's using its date estimates to try and assess how fast things are changing. So Albanian is changing fast. And the other thing it's doing is it's borrowing lots. Okay. So if you rank our meanings, if you rank our languages by how many meanings, what percentage of the meanings have been borrowed, number one language in our database is Arbëresh. Okay. And then the other two Albanian varieties are very high in the list. Okay. Of 170 meanings that are supposed to be resistant to borrowing, 55 are borrowings in Arbëresh. This is so which language? The other question is which other branch in Indo-European is Albanian closest to? There are a whole series of hypotheses on that. We don't have any data in obviously we can't do lists for Mesapic, Illyrian, Phrygian, and so on. What we get is, we get this common branch here, okay? This is Albanian, this is Armenian, and this is Greek. So we have a Greco-Armenian branch here, not relatively short, and we have a very short common theoretical Albanian Greco-Armenian branch, okay? But that number there is 0.49. So it's actually less than 50%, okay, support in our, so if anything, Albanian, the case would be less weak for Albanian with something like Greek and Armenian than it would be with any other branch. But really the result is we don't see a particularly close relationship to any branch, okay? So again, the danger of inferring things from this tree is that you've got to look at the numbers and see whether they're even anywhere near one, let alone 0.49. The earliest branches are 0.23, 0.21, and so on for the deepest nodes. Within Albanian, then, we have these three branches. And again, this was sort of not the result we were expecting. Yeah, we have Geg and standard, sort of standard-ish variety of Geg. I'll ask the experts to talk about it. And we don't get a Tosk-Geg split, which we should have got, surely. But we do get a reasonably accurate date for when Arbëresh splits off, and we get a too late a date for this, okay? And it's almost like, this is another classic example of where phonology and morphology don't go in line with cognacy. And if we do then again, I thought, oh, is that the wrong result? What happened to Tosk and Geg? And so I looked at the data, and I looked at the patterns in the data of where Arbëresh and all the different combinations between the different Albanian varieties. And those are the results. Between standard and Geg, there are only 18 differences, but only 4 of those are loanwords. Standard and Arbëresh, 52 differences. And again, between Geg and Arbëresh, 52 differences. Most of them are loanwords, different loanwords in Italy to the loanwords that or indeed in Greece, to the loanwords that happened in continental Albania, let's say. So the main point is loanwords, we do our best to avoid the problem with loanwords, but they do weaken signal and they make bigger differences. So if we want to ask, about what happened in Albanian. I suppose we can discuss this with the specialists. I'm sorry I've overrun, but it's not a unique case. And what really happened is the loanwords and the rates of change have, the fact that Geg and Tosk in Albania and Kosovo have remained in contact for so long means that their cognacy, you get ongoing cognates being still recognized, and the phonological history is not the same as the lexical history. So with that, I'm going to finish just to the big question. The Albanian lineage is a deep, old lineage. It split maybe even earlier than we thought from the rest. It might not come from the steppe, but it's not the oldest language. And all of these languages have equal antiquity. They all go back to the same Proto-Indo-European language. So it makes no sense really to talk about Albanian as an old language. All of these languages have been transmitted unbroken through all of their generations from Proto-Indo-European to the present. So you can't really say that one is older than the rest. There are some fascinating things about Albanian and its antiquity of its lineage, but it's not the oldest language.
Thank you very much, Professor Hegarty, for your explanation in understandable terms of the ideas and the results of your project and the part of Albanian on it. Është e rëndësishme të kuptojmë se nga ligjërata e profesorit se nuk ka gjuhët nuk ka një datë lindjeje. Pra gjuhët kanë pasardhje, një lineazh që shkon mbrapa në thellë në kohë për miliona vjet. Dhe në këtë aspekt do me thënë vetëm mund të flasim vetëm për vjetërsi në mënyrë metaforike, si shpjegoi dhe profesor Hackstein për gjuhët. Pra edhe vetë gjuha proto-indo-europiane që themi 8000 vjeçare nuk e ka fillimin atë kohë, po ka një proto ose pre-proto-indo-europianishte, e cila dhe ajo ka paraardhësit e veta. Pra në këtë ose Shqipja 6000 vjeçare nuk është aq Shqipja shumë e vjetër se aq, po 6000 vjet është koha e shkëputjes së saj nga trungu i përbashkët indo-europian. Pra kjo ishte edhe thelbi, domethënë që komunikoi në fund profesor Hegarty për lidhur me vjetërsinë e gjuhëve, sepse mund të krijohen dhe janë krijuar edhe koncepte keq kuptime lidhur me këtë. Pra nuk ka gjuhë më të vjetra ose më të reja, ka kronologji relative të shkëputjes ose të faza të caktuara të gjuhës. Tani kemi një kohë për 10 minuta pyetje. 10 minutes for discussion, for questions. Leida, Kapia.
Thank you, Mr. Haggerty, for this fascinating talk. First about about Albanian language. I hope media will be displaying this today. I know you talked a bit about morphology, but I wondered if you could elaborate a little bit more on what do you think it would take to involve morphology in this type of analysis? And do you think by involving it, results would change? What are your more elaborate thoughts on this? Thank you.
The first thing I'd say is morphology is involved in the sense that, for example, to work out which words are cognate, that's the level it's involved. You need to do morphological analysis. And what we chose as our policy is many words are morphologically complex. They've got multiple morphemes. We had to say, okay, we will focus on the root morpheme. There can sometimes be two roots in light verbs or various other constructions. Therefore, you have to have a policy to choose which of those roots you're going to assess cognacy on. So if you ask words like cœur in French, corazón in Spanish, there's an extra suffix in corazón. So what are we going to do? Are we going to say those are partially cognate? There are various approaches to this in linguistic literature. We chose the problem with partial cognacy is the suffix is simply not there in other languages, and you can't assume it will be. You can assume a root will be there in almost all cases. So you can do cognacy reliably between the roots, and that's what these results are showing. So whether you could, one of the things we also do, there's a series of, we do 10 different forms of tests. With these phylogenetic methods, there are various parameters you can change. There are different approaches you can take to different aspects of the analysis. And one of the things you can also do is you can you can tell the model, okay, only return trees that fit with this. So you can give it a constraint in, this is what the Chang et al. Paper did. They gave ancestry constraints. They said, no, only return trees where this language is directly ancestral. Latin is directly ancestral to all spoken Romance languages. Now, I would have said that's an error because that's written Latin, and the direct ancestor of the spoken languages was spoken Latin. So I think that was a slight error, and it was part of the reason for their errors, for their problems. But what you can do, and what we did in one of our analyses, is to say, okay, morphology and phonology say the tree should be this structure. So only return trees, only accept trees that fit with this morphology and phonology. So you can constrain it to morphology and phonology, which is what we did, and it didn't change. It changed the structure of the trees a bit. It didn't change the date very much. Now the date is, the reason we don't use morphology to date from is because it's a weird, it's something, it's hard to ask your data people morphology changes in ways that you can just get rid of something. Most of these things are either they have this morphological system still from Indo-European, or they don't, or they invented this new morphology, which the others don't have. But with a meaning, you can always say, what is your word for this meaning? And you get an answer, and then you can look at its cognitive state. And so it's a meaning slot that is always there through time, and you can always fit it. And it changes through time, but you can always ask the question, okay? With some sound change, you know, what's the form of your initial P? You know, word initial P, what form is it? Well, it then goes to 0. Okay, so if you ask, is this a Kentum or a Satem language? Then you'll get people saying, yes, these are all Kentum. French is Kentum. Well, actually, French starts with us, and so does Portuguese now. Yeah, but we know it comes from Latin. That was Kentum. And then if you do that, you will get a mess that doesn't correspond to our phonology criteria for where French goes. It's not a Satem language, you know. So these things are hard to do, and because a lot of these things disappear, then it's not the same type of data that you can use for doing chronology. So a lot of people say, why do you do it on the basis of lexemes? Well, we don't. We do it on cognosy and deep word relationships, which is proper Indo-European etymology. That's the data we do it, and we do it because that's more or less the only way you can do this dating approach, and we can use the others for all the purposes, you know. So I know what you mean. You could force, we can force it to morphology trees and you get different results, but it's not going to help for the dating.
Thank you. Someone had another question? Yes, Linda
Thank you so
Moniku.
much for this, Linda Moniku, University of Tirana, Department of Linguistics. So thank you very much for this very impressive research presentation. And thanks to the Academy of Science for inviting you to Albania. First of all, it's important, you know, for small countries, I will not say small nations, to prove the historical facts. So it's so well known that Albanian is an old Indo-European language, but when we teach this or we present this to the world, we always base all our information on, you know, historical data. So bringing to life all this data again through scientific research is very, very important for our countries. I know, you know, for Italy or Germany is not that important, but for Albania, and I would assume also for Armenia, these are very important facts. Now, my first question for you is, why haven't you included Arbanitica? I mean, it's understandable that it's because Arbarash and they immigrated from Greece to Italy, but don't you think that maybe by including Arbanitica, we could have a comparison between Albanian and Greek and how all this has changed in the last year?
I was just discussing this at dinner last night. Basically, we would probably need some field work and somebody to go to do this. I would be delighted to have it. What we were doing in this paper was trying to find a chronology and the early branching structure from Proto-Indo-European. Okay, so we actually had a policy of, okay, we've got a lot of languages to do. We've only got a limited amount of time and budget to do this with. We have to set some priorities. Had we had direct contact with someone who said, and there's no question, I'm an expert, I can do this list for you, I'll do it, then we could have included it. But we also had a rule which basically said, if we think this languages are going to be so similar to languages we've already got that it won't tell us anything about the data Proto-Indo-European, then we normally had a cutoff if languages were less than 5% different or expected to be. Now, actually, this probably doesn't fall into that case, I suspect. I don't know what it would be like relative to that, but it's probably more different because of loanwords. I would love to. I was just saying last night over dinner that, I would hope to be able to do an IE core version 2 and bring in lots of other candidates like this. I mean, we only have West Frisian. We should have East Frisian and North Frisian. There are lots of other languages we could do. It's an aspiration, and if you would like to volunteer a specialist, then put them in contact with us and we will very happily add it to the list.
Thank you, I appreciate it very much. And actually, you answered my second question that was about your future projects. So thanks again.
About your future project, the second question, yes? Pyetja e dytë ishte për... I thought, okay. Kishte një pyetje? Ardian Bebiu has a question. Professor Rami Memusha has a question.
And I wanted to ask you, the language you call Albanian from the beginnings, does it include Thracian and Illyrian? Because there is no place for Thracian here. Thank you.
In this analysis, we can't include languages for which we have too little data. Yeah, so we actually, I think we have Gaulish in our list, and we actually also did an analysis without languages that have too little data. So we have that the target list is 170 meanings, but in languages that have fragmentary inscriptions like Gaulish, for example, we got about 60, but it's, as we'll hear in some of the talks coming up, we have to make some quite precise decisions on which word was the word for big, for example. And you might have 2 or 3 candidates and you have very little context to go on to choose which is the most appropriate choice given our criteria. So we have, in fact, we had 4 Anatolian languages coded, but 2 of them have only about 15 answers for our data of 170. And when the method has so little to go on, it can cope with a certain amount of missing data, but beyond a certain point, it starts getting unreliable when you have languages that don't have enough. If we put in one word from one language, we've no idea where it's going to come up in the tree, and it won't mean anything. So if we have languages that we have inscriptions from occasionally, or perhaps a few personal names, or perhaps a few tribe names in ancient literature, we can't get a data list. So we can't put it in that tree. And in those cases, I think we just have to leave it to the specialists in what we do know of those languages to say where they think it might go in the tree, but they're going to have to use other types of language data for that. We can't get, this is based on knowing 170 words in this list. And if we don't know those words, then we can't put them in the, if we don't know enough, we can't put them in the tree, unfortunately. So we haven't got much to say on that. You can use it as inference for what may have been going on at what time and place in history, but we can't really say very much, unfortunately.
Yes, thank you. Ardian Bebiu has another question. No? Microphone.
Thank you for your explanations. We were all very curious to understand more about the article. It's a very difficult matter for a linguist to understand because it comes from mathematical modeling and other things, but we're trying. Now, my question is this. When I look at your trees in general and see, for example, that we have Latin and Italian. There is the branch Italian, there is Latin and then Italian. There is a line that connects them. And then we have, let's say, Albanian and Hebrew. Now, the relationship is not the same because when we talk about the change from Latin to Italian, the shift. It doesn't really involve any population demographic movement. It's a change in language that happens gradually, but geography is not involved. Whereas for our bridge, we have a demographic accident in a way, because we have a group of people that, not for linguistic reasons, they leave a territory and then move to a different territory. So in this case, the change is induced by a factor that is external to language. And I would say, I would bring the same argument for Tocharian, for example, that they moved all the way to different world in a way. Whereas for Slavic language, this change is more linguistic than geographical. So, but if you look at the tree, these lines, they have the same position, then the same meaning. And my question is, does your model take this into account, this thing, the relation between, we say, for example, Albanian moved from, through Anatolia to the Balkans, and this is a group of people that moves, and if I understand it well. It's a movement of people. It's similar to what happened to the Arbrecht much later. But in other cases, the shift from one language to another, it happened because of internal factors in the language. So there is a difference here that I'm not very sure if it is taken into account by your tree model and in general by your model.
Yeah, what I'd say is I realized that the paper was published in Science, so we had to write it in a way that would be normal. We had to explain a lot of linguistic things for non-linguists, was actually how, but you're allowed to assume, and you're expected to assume lots of scientific vocabulary that you don't need to explain to non-scientists because it's in science. So it's a strange, I recognize that really we should, I've written other papers in linguistics, but this really we should do a big paper for linguists, I suppose, out of this. On your question, well, the tree model in any case is an idealization. It's an idealization in linguistics anyway. So what I would say is where we see roles of geography are very different. So English is a good case where we have a great piece of geography that separates those two, separates English from other West Germanic languages, and we get a very long line of independent development. And then it happens to have relatively, well, fairly big number of loan words from contact. So from the Norse contact and then Norman French particularly. So that's a model, and there are various, in the real world, there are various things that explain how languages end up how they do. In the case of Arbrecht, it's because they move, well, there's a sort of migration route through history and different contact languages at different times, which explains some of the differences. Now, unfortunately, all these methods this tree model can show is what it thinks happened in terms of changes of 1 to 0s on different branches. Okay, that's what it can show. There are many different historical contexts that can lead to that, and that has to be part of the interpretation, really, of these results. And so, but you can still do a lot with the language data. You can look, first thing you can do is how many loan words are there? Yeah. Then you can look at, has this branch been changing particularly fast? You can look at the difference, but then if we then did a tree just for Albanian with this sort of data, that included more Albanian varieties, including we can have more Greg and Tosk varieties, less standardized versions, and we can then force the tree to reflect phonological changes or morphological changes, and you can see the differences if you force it or don't force it, and that shows you, our phonological history is not the same as our cognate history, and that's to do with contact and so on. So what typically happens is we have that section in the supplement where we talk about differences with standard morphology and phonology classifications. And those differences are strongest in cases of contact, particularly in dialect continua, or Nuristani languages, a very strange bunch of sort of half Indic, half Iranic languages, lots of contact going on, lots of cognate. The languages are changing, but their cognate sort of, even if they shift, they shift in step, even though like Frisian does this with Dutch. Frisian and Dutch should have more differences than they do in our results, but it's because Frisian and Dutch cognates, you instantly recognize them. And because of the pressure of Dutch, the Frisian speakers will start using their Frisian cognates phonologically in the same meanings the Dutch ones do, because of that pressure. I mean, you even see it in British and American English, actually. And this, I think, has been happening a lot between Geg and Tosk. They're there, so the sound changes are happening, morphological differences are there, but the cognacy can remain aligned. And I think that's really what explains it. So the way I would say, you know, I don't really know how we can feed all that in. We could try putting constraints in the geography. There are people who've worked on these methods and are trying to do what they call contact edges. People working on Uralic, but they haven't got many dating points for Uralic to calibrate the tree. But they say, but we do know that there are Germanic loanwords into this branch of Uralic, and we know what time period that was from the sounds, that we know what stage of Germanic it was. So we're assuming this was maybe 1,800 years ago or somewhere around there, and it gets into this branch of Uralic. So we try and use that sort of horizontal calibration for the tree. So there are people working on methods to try and add to these phylogenetic analyses data like that, geographical contact data. The 2012 paper was sort of infamous because they produced this video of Indo-European spreading through Europe on the basis of using not just calibrations in time, but calibrations in geographical space. But the results were weird and obviously wrong. But the technology, you know, that you can do this technologically, but you need to, it would be another next step for what we can do. So people are very aware that this is important, but it hasn't been built in yet. And the attempt to do it more or less stopped people doing it for the next 10 years, I think, because it went down so badly. So.
Yes, thank you for your question and the answers. And now it's Professor Olav Hackstein's turn to talk about the historical phylogeny of Albanian, part 1.
Yes, thank you very much. Just need to figure out whether this works here, this remote control. Apparently not. Oh yeah, okay. So let's go to first slide here. Thank you very much. So let me perhaps begin with a statement. Our results, of course, can only be as good and reliable as our input data, and a lot hinges on actually significant shared innovations in order to assess branching directions and all this kind of stuff. But let me now start from the beginning. The purpose of my talk is to discuss the latest work on the phylogenetic models of the diversification of the Indo-European language family, focusing in particular, not unexpectedly, on the models proposed by Don Range and his collaborators and by Paul Haggerty. Both the Range tree and Haggerty's model converge in what I would like to call a three-step model of the Indo-European branches splitting off from Proto-Indo-European, assigning, this is much too small, so I beg for your indulgence for this. It's like a vision test if you go to an optician here, right? Assigning the first split off to Anatolian, placing Tocharian in second position, and lastly, having the remaining Indo-European languages begin their migration. And here is Paul Haggerty's model with Anatolian. This is a very small point here, Anatolian at the top. Then comes second Tocharian. Here you just have to trust me because most of us can't read it. And then come the Balkan Indo-European languages, but mind you, in alphabetical order. So yeah, you have to, so it's the Balkan languages, Albanian and Greek and so on. So the interesting thing is that the trees devised by Ranges and Haggerty's respective teams feature, well, by and large, Tocharian and Balkan Indo-European as consecutive clades, thus assigning a particular antiquity to the diversification of the three Balkan Indo-European languages, Albanian, Armenian, and Greek, in alphabetical order with no implication for a hierarchy in antiquity from the remaining Indo-European languages. Now, let me start from the very beginning. So, because Anatolian and Tocharian were on the top of this scheme that we saw, that we've just seen, the debate surrounding the Anatolian first and Tocharian second hypothesis is still running and hotly debated in Indo-European, but despite claims to the contrary, there indeed is firm evidence in favor of it, and the evidential basis may even be further corroborated. Anatolian and Tocharian share a host of morphological and syntactic parameters that are absent from nuclear Indo-European, including Albanian and the other Indo-European languages. Here is a dossier of such features, some of which might be disputed, but there are others that are quite watertight. So the rarity and limited development of simple thematic verbs, I can't spare you here with details. Collective inflection in Hittite and Tocharian, inherited agglutinative case morphology in the case of the inherited ablative and allative cases of Anatolian and of Tocharian, and an important addendum, Anatolian and Tocharian lack the long vowel subjunctive. And a host of syntactic features where Anatolian and Tocharian converge. So SOV word order, post positions instead of prepositions. Post apposition is not to be underestimated here. Correlative constructions, lack of, and notably lack of compound verbs. Lack of compound verbs in Anatolian and Tocharian, which is quite significant, setting Anatolian and Tocharian off from the classical Indo-European languages, to which I would also be given or inclined to count Albanian too. There are then also occasional lexical correspondences between Tocharian and Hittite, or Anatolian and Tocharian. The word for hunger, Hittite kasht, Tocharian kest, as opposed to Latin zitis, Greek phthisis, Greek kshiti, or famous one, Hittite eku and Tocharian ab yolk, drink, as opposed to innovative nuclear Indo-European pech, to take a zip, something. And C, Anatolian and Tocharian lack the semantic development of the Indo-European root bu, grow, become, to alight, and eventually an auxiliary verb. So in Tocharian, the related root putk still is a full verb, whereas many other nuclear Indo-European languages have begun to develop this self-same root towards a light verb and eventually towards an auxiliary. But of course, cases like the aforegoing can only claim significance as part of cumulative evidence. But there are also remarkable phonological archaisms, like the preservation of dental plus velar onset in the lexeme for earth in Hittite and Tocharian, and the joint failure of Anatolian and Tocharian to form thorn clusters, the Tocharian preservation of the dental in Tocharian antapi, both sides, as against the loss of the dental in nuclear Indo-European, Old High German umbi, Old Irish imb, Umbrian amp, Greek amphi, and so much for Anatolian Tocharian features. None of the aforementioned features is shared by Balkan Indo-European languages, including Albanian. On the other hand, a host of features sets off Tocharian from Anatolian. So Anatolian is more innovative, in fact, than Anatolian. Tocharian is like an intermediate language between Anatolian and nuclear Indo-European. There are so some innovations in Tocharian that Tocharian shares with classical Indo-European languages. The activization of the inherited NT participle. In Hittite, it can still be intransitive, but in Tocharian, it behaves like an NT participle in Old Church Slavic or in Germanic. Then the reduplicated resultive state, stative perfect, which is not found in Hittite, but it's found in Tocharian. I will spare you with the details. So inventories have been compiled by J. Jasanoff and Michael Weiss. So to sum up, Tocharian assumes a second position, intermediate between Anatolian on the one hand and nuclear Indo-European on the other. Having dealt with the respective cladistic positions of Anatolian and Tocharian, a third question concerns now our core problem and question here, the cladistic position of Balkan Indo-European. A loose connection, by the way, of Balkan Indo-European with Tocharian has been suspected since Julius Pokorny in 1990, with Klingenschmidt also. Pokorny diagnosed a certain overlap of Tocharian with this Balkan Indo-European group, gewisse Übereinstimmungen mit der Balkan-Gruppe, and Joachim Matzinger and Schindler put Matzinger devised a time-space model involving 3 stages of split-offs: Anatolian first, Tocharian second, Italo-Celtic and Greek and Anatolian, continuing to split off. And this idea is not new, this observation. It's at least 100 years old, that Tocharian has certain innovations overlapping with Balkan Indo-European. Now let me briefly digress on this. Innovations shared by Tocharian with Balkan Indo-European. There are there's a catalog of morphological innovations shared by Tocharian, Balkan, Indo-European. I would count among these Tocharian be clavateur, which means is called, with Albanian chuhet, chuhet, and the innovative factative suffix n plus ye, in certain, so it has attained some productivity, it's innovative. Then the peculiar nominal collective suffix in echi, as found in the vocative of Tocharian a, which has recently been discovered, the vocative klai in Tocharian a from knai, o woman, which is an equation with Greek gynai, and polylexical patterns, and so on and so forth. And in the innovative clustering of pronominal stems, Tocharian accords in non-trivial fashion with Greek and Armenian. For instance, the Tocharian B complementizer kache can reconstruct it in this fashion, as you see in the projection on the slide, forming an equation with Armenian, the secondary univerbation of e and te, yete, and also with Mycenaean and Homeric Greek ho, te. Greek systematically replaces the que quo pronoun by the hyo pronoun, and the same scheme recurs with Tocharian a kupre and Armenian yerp and Homeric ofra. quite surprisingly. So something must be going on here. Now, conversely, however, the Balkan European languages do not bear the slightest, now it's time to pour some water into the wine again, to bear the slightest resemblance to the Anatolian Tocharian type of archaic morphosyntax, but instead resemble classical, or especially in the case of Albanian, even post-classical Indo-European languages. The most important morphological and syntactic features that distinguish Anatolian and Tocharian from nuclear Indo-European listed above are not shared by Balkan Indo-European. Rather, Balkan Indo-European patterns with nuclear Indo-European and the classical Indo-European languages in this regard. And what is more, there are surprising and significant all-pervasive innovations that clearly establish that Balkan Indo-European patterns with nuclear Indo-European. I name two examples in the following. A prominent isogloss that clearly marks the Anatolian Tocharian branches as archaic and sets them off from all other Indo-European branches, including Balkan Indo-European, has so far gone unnoticed, namely the rise of verbal compounds and the correlated productivity of the so-called Proto-Indo-European S-mobile roots exhibiting the accretion of an S prefix. The formation of verbal compounds is an innovation of the Indo-European or within the Indo-European languages. It is in its infancy and completely unproductive in Anatolian and Tocharian, but by contrast, tremendously productive in the post-Anatolian and post-Tocharian nuclear Indo-European branches, including Celtic, Germanic, Baltic, Slavic, Italic, and Albanian, Greek, and so on. Crucially, there is a correlation. There is a correlation between prefixation and local particles, which has spread in nuclear and European, and the productivity of the mobile S prefix. And languages like Anatolian Tocharian with unproductive local particle prefixation exhibit significantly fewer cases of mobile S, and the exact inverse holds for languages like Albanian, Greek, Germanic, and Slavic with a wealth of S prefixed roots. This dichotomy between Anatolian Tocharian non-S roots versus Albanian and nuclear European S roots, S prefix roots, can be illustrated by the following non-exhaustive list of cases here tabulated. On the left, you find Tocharian roots without S prefix, and in the right-hand column, you find the Greek and Albanian etymological correspondence with an S prefix. Maybe I forego to go in greater detail through all these examples, especially now looking at our schedule. But this also recurs with labial onset roots. There we have the root, for instance, to per, to fly, to carry be prairie without S. And then we have sper, fly, set forth in Albanian with an onset in F, fier, far from sperchom. And we have pelch, speak, in Tocharian pull, and we have spell, in Albanian fjalle, SP yields F, and so on and so forth, and also with coronal onsets, the same kind of dichotomy. This list is not an exhaustive list, so it just goes on and on. There are many, many such examples. So this has some significance, actually, showing that Albanian patterns with nuclear Indo-European languages. There are other pervasive innovations, innovative polylexical patterns. For instance, the negation, which is quite complex, there is a tripartite negation scheme in the Indo-European languages made up of the negation ne, Let me try to highlight this. Here's the negation ne. Then a particle ara, which means definitely or justly, not definitely, and then a third particle which means in my lifetime. So not at all in my lifetime. And this tripartite scheme then is reduced in a peculiar way. Anatolian and Tocharian keep all three of these three particles, whereas Greek and Albanian show a reduction. So Albanian goes even farther than Greek by getting rid of ara. So there's no trace of ara in the Albanian negation. So Albanian occupies here an intermediate position between Greek and the rest of nuclear Indo-European. This now brings us to the next slide. So I must, how are we to reconcile the Tocharian second model with the convergences that we mentioned earlier, and how are we to reconcile it with the Balkan Indo-European languages? Well, the convergences between Tocharian and the Balkan Indo-European languages can be remnants of earlier prehistoric aerial contact phenomena. Here, the Proto-European dialect continuum model is perhaps quite adequate or worth considering. Proto-Indo-European, if assumed to be a natural language, can safely be or must be assumed to have had dialects, and it is likewise natural for adjacent dialects to develop and exhibit aerial contact phenomena. This, of course, accords with the uniformitarian principle. The general processes and principles which can be noticed in observable history are applicable in all stages of language history. Linguistic diversification does not preclude prehistoric aerial contacts. It would be fallacious to take every linguistic convergence to imply a shared node or clade or phylum. Compare, for instance, the shared feature of the have perfect and standard average European, the Scandinavian language. Albanian and Modern Greek all share this feature, though it certainly does not originate from a Scandinavian, Balkan, Indo-European clade. And the idea of setting up a prehistoric Balkan Indo-European subgroup has been entertained for a long time. Already Antoine Meillet, the famous French scholar, in 1908 cautiously observed some linguistic similarities between Albanian, Armenian, Greek, and Tocharian. He presented this chart that you see here. According to Meillet, it's likely that Tocharian takes an intermediate position between Italic, Celtic, Greek, Armenian, and Slavic. Il est vraisemblable que le Tocharian occupe parmi les dialectes indo-européens une place intermédiaire entre l'italo-celtique, le grec, l'arménien et le slave. And another scholar, Douglas Q. Adams, in 1984, he published an article, and according to him, he diagnosed the grouping of Tocharian with Meillet's Northwestern group in the first instance, with particular close ties with Germanic, which appears as a quite strange claim, or a bold claim even. Then he goes on to say, I quote, "The ties Tocharian has with both Greek and Indic outside the Northwestern group reflect later contacts on the part of pre-Tocharians with the pre-Greeks and the pre-Indics, as the pre-Tocharians move progressively eastward in the late Proto-European world," unquote. Another quote of Adams, 1984, it might not be too out of the line to suggest that that variety of late Proto-European that was to become Proto-Tocharian first took shape and became in some measure distinguishable from other varieties of Proto-European in the course of the 4th millennium BC amidst the other members of Meillet's northwestern group, and then square brackets, my boldface highlighting, to which we should also add Albanian, unquote. That was Adams in 1984. Tocharian and Northwest European show prehistoric aerial contacts. A non-exhaustive list is here on the handout. Is according to what I would go for, the result of prehistoric language contact between area contacts between or Proto-European dialects. So Tocharian exhibits some connection to the Western group. 7 examples. So there are function words like Tocharian B, ente, which is akin to Old High German chwanta, or Tocharian B, trap, anstoßen, straucheln, and Germanic treffen, and persk, to be afraid, and other. I forgot to mention all the examples here. And also, there is a list, non-exhaustive list of Greek Tocharian isoglosses and prehistoric aerial contacts, including significant morphological innovations like the Greek and Tocharian innovation of the genitive dual ending oisi, which is not Proto-European. It's an innovation and shared by Homeric Greek and by Tocharian and other. There's an entire list. I can't read this in greater detail. Maybe it's now time to come to a conclusion. Like the convergences between Northwestern European Greek and Tocharian, so too can the convergence between Albanian Greek and Tocharian be the result of prehistoric aerial contacts. The pervasive innovations discussed earlier, including, for instance, the S prefix, identify the Balkan Indo-European languages and thus Albanian as classical, that is, nuclear Indo-European languages. Albanian may even appear to be fairly innovative. Compare, for instance, the reduction of the inventory of participles inherited from Proto-Indo-European. So the NT participle, the medial passive participle, and the perfect participle suffixes, they got lost. They are no longer productive in Albanian, contrasting with Greek and many other branches of Indo-European, which have kept the NT participle down to the present day, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, this now brings me to the end and perhaps to my final, but not hopefully last words. So, as Paul Haggerty already stated here, I completely concur with Paul Haggerty. I think all Indo-European languages are created equal, and inasmuch as they are Indo-European, they go back to Proto-Indo-European and therefore are of the same age. So that was basically our earlier conclusion in the preceding lecture. And yeah, this is actually what I would like to end my talk with. So I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Hackstein, for your talk, which supports the science article with evidences from Tocharian and Balkan Indo-European. And now is the time for questions.
Can I reactivate the projection somehow? I didn't. Yeah, reactivate it. So, yeah.
Yeah,
Marek
Meyer.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this extremely interesting article. And I would like to ask you about one thing, because having listened to Professor Haggerty's talk first and then to your talk, it is interesting that, well, Professor Haggerty said in that method, you basically do not include phonology and morphology because the method is not suitable for dealing with that, and then cognacy is what works and it is used. In your talk, on the other hand, it might have been interesting to the audience that it's almost exclusively, in fact, morphological, morphosyntactic innovations. And then the lexical stuff is, I mean, it is there, but it is usually there when it is accompanied by some sort of interesting morphological or pragmatic or grammaticalization related things. So I would like you to comment on that. How do you view, especially for the entire audience, also non-Indo-Europeanists, how would you evaluate the relative importance of lexical evidence and morphological, phonological evidence in subgrouping and in chronologization? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Marek. That's a very important question, and I already spilled some ink on this question in my Pommelsbrunn-Beitrag. So, but it's not easily accessible to except through my webpage, perhaps. This has also been discussed, this question, by other scholars, of course, and I agree with assigning more significance to shared morphological patterns, in fact, than to lexical patterns. So shared morphological innovations are more important than lexical convergences, unless you have cumulative evidence. So this, of course, is an exception. If you have an accumulation of lexical correspondences, then, of course, it's significant. But basically, there is also complex morphological and also syntactic patterns, which in accumulation must not be underestimated, and especially if they have gotten lost in other language branches. So also phonological convergences practically don't count, because sound changes are repeatable across languages and do not bear any significance, again, unless found in accumulation. So maybe accumulation is the thing which makes things either significant, or in the absence of accumulation, certain overlaps can be trivial or accidental simply, and need not lead us to infer a clade or something like that, or even areal convergence. But I think maybe my idea was that we need to augment our thinking with prehistoric convergence models too, and I'm not the first one to say this. This has been preempted, I think, at least by Don Rinch too, in his HSK article on the dialectology of Indo-European in this Indo-European Languages volume, Handbücher zur Sprach- und Kommunikationswissenschaft, HSK. Yeah, so much for that. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. Another question? Professor Hegarty?
Yeah, I was just actually checking up, and I thought I'd let you know about, I just looked up the Anatolian shared cognates with Albanian compared to Hittite and Tocharian being. Hittite was 7.5% and Tocharian is 11.1%. So, but just, I want to use that also, slight support for the idea that of the two, Albanian is closer to Tocharian. But also because Tocharian is younger than Hittite. So, but that I also want to point out with that how little data at this time depth. We have 170 meanings. So we're only talking about, 15, 20 meanings that might be shared. And a few of those, fewer, are shared in other branches. This is what happens at the time depth of Indo-European. And I also wanted to point it out in the context of Don Rinch. So Don Rinch he did a phylogenetic analysis with a very different method, not Bayesian. So he does try to find what they call the perfect phylogeny. And he actually says in the result, we can't get one. There is no single perfect tree. The least bad one, then he takes Germanic out because Germanic is causing lots of problems, doesn't know. He also leaves Albanian out sometimes as well because it doesn't want to go in very many places. And he actually admits, if you look at the data, he does have a tree, but most of those nodes have very little support. They've only got a few characters. Because what he tries to do is he looks at morphological, phonological characters. Yeah, but this one, it could be independent, it could be parallel innovation. This one, he tries to filter the data and he ends up with very few characters he really trusts. And most of the nodes are not supported by many characters. And all of the trees are contradicted by other characters. And this is part of the problem. You know, we can always find sections, you know, bunches of features that suggest a link between these branches and those branches or those ones. But there are other features that suggest that cross-cut with them. And this has been the constant problem. And, you know, I'm putting forward this one. This is what the cognates say, and the cognates also do not agree on a single tree, but they can give us pointers to these sort of things. It's a hard task. Yeah, it would be. And again, you can also interpret it like you did as a branching sequence, or you can say, well, maybe it's geographical. Yeah. And this is a dialect continuum, and then there are innovations that spread through a large part of it, but not necessarily the same part. So, you know, we're trying to work out what the balance is between migrations and splits and dialect continua, where there's ongoing contact in subparts. And it's, you know, all data are useful, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. We are, of course, working from different angles. So we are Indo-Europeanists and we are on the empirical side. We are looking for etymologies. We are reconstructing languages. And you are looking from the other side, from so the computational side, how to interpret the data. And I would say, again, that I would attach different weight to different kinds of evidence. So if an innovation is all pervasive, for me, then it is more important, actually, and more significant, actually. I cannot resist this or withstand this conclusion then. And but our big task is, of course, to augment the data and to have more input data. And let's see then what the results will look like. I'm completely open, of course, regarding the results.
I just want to put in a perspective, because people like Russell Gray, who was running this department and funding it, and he's not a linguist at all. He's a phylogeneticist, but he says, look at this. But his perception was, from a methodological point of view.
Yeah, these questions are linguistic questions and not archaeological questions primarily, or not genetic questions, because pots are not people and genes cannot speak. So, I mean, bones cannot speak, right? So we have to keep that apart. So we have to give primacy, first of all, to the linguistic and reconstructional data, I think. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Matzinger, yeah.
For my lab to throw in a piece you can chew on.
Yeah.
The tricky thing about lexicon, oh, thanks so much, dude. The tricky thing about lexicon, as many of you probably will know, think about Armenian. In the first days when Armenian came into the knowledge of linguists or pre-linguists, so to speak, it was classified as an Iranian language just because of the sheer amount of Iranian loanwords in Armenian. It was only afterwards when people discovered working on strict methods, oh, come on, this is an Indo-European language of its own, so to speak. So same thing with Albanian. Look at the lexicon. What is tricky about, and I wouldn't say tricky in this case, what is so particular about Albanian language is that is so open to lexical influences from all sides. And this makes it hard for Indo-Europeanists to find in the lexicon of Albanian true Indo-European cognate forms. We all know that. But let's turn to morphology, to the structure of the language.
Yeah.
Just have a look at the older stages, and I'm speaking of at the station defining old in this case. Look at the old Albanian verbal system. Wow, astonishingly how complex and how corresponding to what we reconstruct for Indo-European subjectual participle. But the finite forms, astonishingly complex and in accordance with we reconstruct for other Indo-European languages like Greek, Indo-Iranian. So preservation of both conjunct, subjunctive, optative in form and function. Wow. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much. I completely agree. And every natural language is a patchwork of innovation and retention. And it's quite, I completely agree. Thank you very much.
Po, dhe në fakt Shqipja u cilësua, u gjetë si gjuhë indo-europiane pikërisht nëpërmjet analizës morfologjike të sistemit numërorëve, për emrave, mbërresave folore të nga Franz Bopi. Now I invite Giulio Imberciadori to talk about the historical phylogeny of Albanian, part 2.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, hopefully, did everybody receive the handout for my talk? Because, okay, maybe there are some people still missing it, then maybe we wait a couple of minutes, yeah, until everybody gets a copy, because otherwise it can become a bit hard to follow without having the data inside. All right. So. Okay, maybe now I shall start if everybody has a handout at disposal. Well, I will basically follow up on Professor Hackstein's talk, in particular focusing more on the so-called Balkan Indo-European languages, right? Which we have heard mentioned several times today, and which are traditionally deemed to be at least 3 of them. So Albanian, Greek of region, but in the following we will simply speak of Greek, and Armenian. So they are usually, it's claimed that they exhibit a greater degree of proximity, but under 1.1 on the handout, I try to gather a bit of literature on this topic, which is quite extensive, as you can imagine. And there you see that scholars also kind of proposed different accounts for this greater similarity among the so-called Balkan Indo-European languages. So some scholars favor the assumption of a greater cognacy among these languages, a greater degree of cognacy. Others assume the sort of prehistoric contact in order to explain the greater proximity, and there were also scholars trying to operate with both processes. Well, our goal for today, you see under 1.2, will be to investigate some old and new isoglosses within so-called Balkan Indo-European, so among Albanian, Greek, and Armenian, in particular focusing on 2 levels of analysis, which we have already heard mentioned today. The first one is morphology, and the other one, which maybe is remained a bit in the background till now, is semantics. So we will be searching basically for non-trivial innovations shared by at least 2 of these 3 so-called Balkan Indo-European languages, since common innovations methodologically are usually regarded as our most reliable tool in order to identify a closer proximity among languages. But before diving into the material on page 2, I would like to first make 2 general observations. So the first one is that the analysis and material which you find in this handout is largely based on the Peva dictionary, which we have heard today mentioned by Professor Hackstein. We are working on this dictionary since several years in the meantime in Munich. And the second observation is that As you see, the handout is quite full, so I won't have time to go in detail through all of these forms. I will be a bit selective in the following, but of course, if you have a question or if you would like me to expand on some specific forms, please feel free to ask. Methodologically, 1.4, I think it's first also important to mention which cases I decided to exclude from my collection of morphological and semantic isoglosses. 1.4.1, some cases of this kind was, for instance, where we find some extra Albanian lexical matches, which is good, but these matches have quite trivial morphological structure. So, for instance, Albanian fare clearly builds a match with Greek spora, but we also know that abstracts of the Tome type were highly productive in Proto-Indo-European. So in this case, it's really difficult to exclude that. Also, other branches may have inherited such form, and then simply they could have lost it in their prehistory. Other cases which I didn't include in my collection, 1.4.2, are again cases where we have some extra Albanian lexical matches, maybe even with some common morphological innovation, but the involved meanings are quite diverging. For instance, Albanian diale, boy, builds a match with an Armenian word, del, which however means herb or medicine. So we may even reconstruct a common preform, something like delhno, the sprouting one, but here the semantic gap, in my view at least, rather points to independent, non-shared innovations of these two languages. And then finally, 1.4.3, I also did not include cases where above all, the morphological analysis is ambiguous or unclear. For instance, among Indo-Europeanists, the Albanian word for allows in the Tosk variant 3 is quite famous because it builds a perfect match with Greek, konis, approximately the same meaning, and this point to a common preform kionid. But we also have to recall that Germanic points to very similar, though not identical, but very similar preforms. So maybe Germanic could have also inherited this preform kionid, which in this case would no longer be a common innovation between Albanian and Greek. And here there's also the morphological ambiguity I was hinted at before. So we have an id stem, a very rare stem formation type for Proto-Indo-European with an O grade in the root. So it's not really clear, to me at least, what morphological is going on here. And if this morphology is not clear, then it becomes difficult to understand which language innovated and where precisely the isogloss is. Right. And then finally, at the very bottom of page 2, I also did not include in a sort of detailed or systematic way those cases, for instance, of morphological isoglosses, which have already been discussed at length or in detail in works on the phylogenetic position of Albanian or on Balkan Indo-Europeans. For instance, the shared use of the prefix me in verbal formations both in Phrygian and Armenian. Joachim Matzinger has discussed it at length in previous papers, so I did not include also such case. Page 3, let's now turn to first the morphological isoglosses among the so-called Balkan Indo-European languages, and I divided them according to the different morphological processes, which in every single case is going on. So for instance, we have a subsection of shared substantivizations. This is 2.1. And we will simply pick up one example for each subsection just to get an idea of the general process. In the case of shared substantivizations, I think that an interesting case is the one under 2.1.1. And this is the gag form ame with a nice nasal vowel, smell or odor. It has long been known that this form builds a match with Greek, Attic Greek osme, but outside Attic we even have a more conservative variant, odme, so it's even more clear that this is precisely the same form. And what is morphologically interesting here is that we have originally an abstract formed by means of a suffix mech. So we know that this suffix built not primary but secondary abstracts in Proto-Indo-European because these abstracts are basically substantivizations of underlying adjectives in mo, like Greek therme beside thermos. In fact, the involved root had built a different primary abstract, which was an S-stem, was hedos. So this seems to be a morphological innovation common to Albanian and Greek. Next subsection is a 2.2, so towards the bottom of page 3. And here I gathered some cases where Albanian and some other so-called Balkan Indo-European languages seems to exhibit suffixation or the same suffixation of some secondary morpheme, in some cases of quite rare secondary morphemes among at least the classical Indo-European languages. A case in point on page 4 is the Albanian word for pear tree or pear, so dardha. Again, people have long recognized that this word must be cognate somehow with its Greek semantic equivalent, akherdos. In Greek, there is also akras, which is related, but is morphologically a bit more remote. Now, in this case, it is clear that dardha and akherdos cannot be perfectly equated from a formal point of view because Albanian points to an O grade, Greek points to an E grade in the root morpheme. But we can regard these forms as independent substantivizations of the same underlying adjective, which I would like to reconstruct here, either has gjerdo or gjirdo, so it's not very important here if we reconstruct the full grade or the zero grade in the root morpheme. What is interesting is that we have an underlying base gjer, probably meaning pear, and morphologically, a derivation by means of an otherwise very rare but not unparalleled suffix do. So the fact that we find an adjectives in do, secondary one, both in the prehistory of Greek and Albanian, may point to a non-trivial morphological isogloss between these two languages. Section 2.3, now we go over to another morphological process, namely the so-called back formation. And an interesting example here might be the Albanian word for year, in standard Albanian vit, of course, but if we go back to old gag, then this word appears to be neuter and to exhibit the shape viet. And this makes it even clearer that this word builds a formal and semantic equation with Greek ethos, same meaning, pointing to a previous S stem, wetos. Regarding this preform, it is important to recall what quite well-known Indo-Europeanist Brand Wine, approximately 15 years ago, claimed about this S stem. He proposed it, or he argued it, to be a back formation to the genitive of a root noun with the meaning year. So this genitive would have become a so-called genitive of time with the meaning during the year, and then many languages kind of back-formed words for year or with related meanings from this genitive of time. Now, morphologically, it is interesting to note that outside Albanian and Greek, these back formations never inflects as S stems. We mostly find thematic forms, so O stems. For instance, in cuneiform Luvium, ushi, ear, or in Vedic vatsa, so the animal belonging, being born in the ear, so having one ear, which is the calf. The back formation as an S stem, we only find it in Albanian and Greek. So again, this may be a case of a shared morphological innovation between these two branches. And if we remain in the domain of so-called Balkan Indo-European, that's the top of page 5, there is also another well-known case of shared back formation, this time, however, involving Albanian and Armenian. And this has been already discussed, for instance, by Gert Klingenschmidt and Joachim Matzinger, namely the back formation of the numeral, masculine numeral for 1 from the feminine stem, Armenian mi and Albanian nie. So I just wanted to mention it marginally here as another case of shared back formation within Balkan Indo-European languages. Another domain where we could expect to find some common morphological innovations, this is under 2.4, is the domain of root extensions, which was also, of course, a morphological process. And here under 242, we have a potentially interesting case because this seems to be a case where Albanian only finds a match in Armenian. And this is the Albanian word for to wear shoes, mbahet, which can be morphologically segmented as a prefix, and a lexical core ath. We have dialectal evidence in Albanian pointing to this morphological segmentation. And through the assumption of some Auslautverhärtung, we can actually identify here an underlying root, haud, which as such only finds a match in Armenian, in particular in a nominal form, aud, shoe. The interesting fact from a morphological point of view is that this root is also attested in many other Indo-European branches, like in Italic, in Anatolian, in Balto-Slavic, but this DH root final segment only seems to occur in Albanian and Armenian. So this seems to be, again, a morphological innovation which happened in the prehistory of only these two languages. We may even speculate on the origin of this DH extension. In my view, it is most plausible to explain it starting from a light verb construction, hau plus bhet, so to put on shoes. But this light verb construction became a neo-root only in Albanian and Armenian, as we have seen. And then page 6, final subsection as far as morphological isoglosses are concerned. 2.5, you see there, this is sort of mixed bag. So here I try to gather possible morphological isoglosses which cannot so easily be subsumed under one and the same morphological process as it was the case so far. And the third example in this subsection, so 2.5.3, I think is quite interesting. This is, of course, a well-known word, the Albanian word for wine, in the Tosk variant again, or standard variant, vera. And what is interesting here from a morphological viewpoint is the feminine gender of this form. Because among the members of the well-known Indo-European word family for wine or related items, the only other branch where we find a feminine form is Greek. And there we find the Greek form oine, which formally is perfectly comparable with Albanian vera. Semantically, however, the two forms diverge, since oine in most ancient Greek actually means vine. So it indicates the wine plant and not wine specifically. However, this is in line with the morphological pattern which we find quite well attested in Greek, according to which feminine forms can be employed to indicate the plant or the tree from which masculine or neuter substances are derived. And for instance, we find elaion, neuter, which is the olive oil, but elaia is feminine, and this is the olive tree. So I think that here the free form common to both oine and vera, namely something like woinech, must have originally indicated the wine plant, the vine, but we can observe that in the history of Greek, there was the possibility for a sort of metonymic shift to take place. So oine in later Greek does not only mean vine, but also wine through metonymy. So I think that this metonymy also took place in the prehistory of Albanian, and this explains why vera in attested Albanian only means wine. But morphologically, the fact that we have a common preform woinech can represent feminine, can represent a shared morphological innovation. And then the final case that I would like to discuss with you today before coming to conclusions is under 2.6, and here I collected some potential cases of semantic innovations shared by so-called Balkan Indo-European languages. We will remain in the domain of Greco-Albanian isoglosses, and in particular, I would like to discuss with you on page 7 under 2.6.2 the feminine stem of the Albanian adjective for dark or black, which is of course ez, but with a suppletive form in the feminine ezez. And already Martin Holt proposed, in my view, quite persuasively to equate zeze, Albanian zeze, with the Greek word deisa, which means slime or filth. And building on Holt's proposal, I would propose that here the underlying root is something like gjuhëve, with the meaning blaze, burn, or shine. You see it's under 2.6.2.2. We have Baltic derivatives of this root, which points to this original meaning. In order to explain the Albanian and Greek form, we can reconstruct a so-called devi derivative, so something like gjuhëve, using a particular suffix EH2 called devi. But what is interesting here is that the meaning of this devi derivative probably was in origin something like belonging to burning, burned, whence, dark or black. And we do have semantic parallels for this development from burnt to dark and black. And so this meaning dark black is then directly preserved and continued in Albanian, easy, whereas in Greek, it underwent a sort of trivial further development from the dark or black substance, namely slime or filth. But what is relevant for us here is that the semantic development from burnt to dark or black seems to have taken place only in the prehistory of Albanian and Greek, because as we have seen, the Baltic derivatives like Latvian svajdrit still means blaze, shine, or similar. So potentially we have a semantic innovation common to both languages. But now I think, as I've said at the beginning, we have to skip some material. If you want, you can read it in due calm later. And so we try to jump now to page 8, section 4, and try to draw some more general conclusions from the material which I collected in this handout. As you see under 4.2, an important thing that we can first note is that Albanian seems to show a greater proximity to Greek than to Armenian. Out of the 22 isoglosses, which I treated in this handout, Armenian only appears as a match in 5 out of them, and as an exclusive match only in 3. So it's quite low numbers. And there is even one case which is a bit problematic, so we didn't have time to discuss it, but it is the etymology of the Albanian word for beach, ache in plural, which could even point to a case where Armenian seems to be excluded from a Greco-Albanian isogloss. This will be, of course, quite relevant. On the other hand, for 3, Greek appears in much more cases as an exclusive match of Albanian, approximately in 15 cases out of the 22 examined in this talk. And this is methodologically important because this is in line with the cumulativity that we have heard mentioned so many times today. So this kind of recurrent correspondences between Albanian and Greek compensate or can compensate for the fact that some shared morphological or semantic innovations can, of course, be seen as more trivial or less significant than others. So I admit there is some degree of subjectivity involved there, but due to the fact that this correspondence seems to be recurrent, then the likelihood that they are simply due to chance becomes or may become lower. And finally, a sort of final speculation under 4.4. So which kind of concrete scenario may we set up in order to account for this greater proximity, linguistic proximity between Greek and Albanian? Well, a first possibility, for instance, could be to set up a sort of phylogenetic subnode uniting these two branches, but we should also keep in mind that there is an important isogloss that seems to also separate or divide Albanian and Greek, namely the so-called satem-kentum opposition. Of course, we can kind of discuss about how we interpret this isogloss, a diachronic or an aerial one, but this seems to separate those branches. Therefore, I think it is more advisable to account for these morphological and semantic innovations shared by Albanian and Greek by assuming the existence of a sort of Paleo-Balkanic Sprachbund, something that has already been proposed, as I have said at the beginning, which probably must have stretched across the 3rd millennium BCE, more or less. If we want to be even more specific, we may try to say that probably stretched across the 2nd half of the 3rd millennium BCE. In this case, the terminus postquem for this period of aerial contact, of course, would be the arrival in the Balkans, both of the pre-Greek Cantum speakers and of the pre-Albanian Satem speakers, which probably could have been completed by the half of the 3rd millennium BCE. The terminus antequem must have been the beginning of the migration towards the south by the pre-Greek Cantum speakers, which most likely started around the beginning of the second millennium BCE, because already in the 16th century BCE, through Mycenaean Greek, Greeks are already attested in their historical settlements. A very final remark on this, if we assume that during this period of intensive aerial contact in the third millennium BCE between pre-Greek and pre-Albanian, pre-Armenian was no longer in contact with these two languages, this may explain why the number of exclusive isoglosses between Albanian and Armenian seems to be much lower than the number of exclusive isoglosses between Albanian and Greek, at least as far as morphology and semantics are concerned, as we have seen today. So, shumë faleminderit për vëmendjen tuaj.
I thank Giulio Imberciadori for his talk focused on the relationships between Albanian and Greek within Balkan Indo-European, analyzing evidences of shared innovations in morphology and semantics. Now, any questions? Yes, Linda Monico.
Where you define that the period of the intensive aerial contact likely stretched across the second half and the third millennium BCE. Now, historically, and maybe I'm totally mistaken, so I'd like an explanation. So historically, in all our books, like Illyrians are mentioned to have inhabited the Balkan Peninsula starting about like 1,000 years ago. So that century BC. And now you are stretching it even further. So you go 2,500 and 3,000. So if they arrived in this region later on, and of course the Doric movement and Illyrian movement are mentioned to be around this time, where do you see this conflict?
Yeah, that's of course a very good question, and I mean I'm chiefly an historical linguist, so I mean that's the matter that I kind of master the least in this talk. But I think that my intuition is that I mean if Greeks must have kind of entered or starting migrating toward the south approximately by the beginning of the second millennium BCE. I think that this kind of context must have taken place somewhere in the central or northern Balkan regions in the third millennium BC. So we must kind of be probably not in the historical settlements of Greek, so not in the southern Balkans, but more to the central or northern area. That would be my intuition. And this kind of deep chronology may also kind of fit with the sort of deeper chronology that also Paul Haggerty proposed for the whole Indo-European family. And yeah, so this would be my kind of very short question. So either central or northern before kind of, yes, pre-Greeks started migrating toward the south, but in the 16th century BC, Mycenaean is already attested there. So I think that third millennium BC is the most likely candidate for this prehistoric concept to have taken place, right?
Thank you very much. And this is an excellent conclusion also that might change also our history books and everything also worldwide. Thanks.
Thanks.
Aristotle Spiro.
Thank you for your presentation. I was, it is fascinating that you present some correlations between Greek and Albanian. And you said in some point that there could be a Sprachbund in the sense that existed before the modern Sprachbund, Balkan Sprachbund. Does this give rise to elaborate on such an issue, or can we talk about Balkan Sprachbund before the Common Era.
Yeah, no, that's also a fair point. Yeah, so the kind of strong version of my proposal, which, as mentioned, is kind of in line with what people have partially already proposed on this, is that we should actually assume a sort of, yes, prehistoric Balkan Sprachbund, which is kind of independent from the historical ones. So it happened probably kind of, so kind of 1,500 till 2,000 years before. An interesting thing that I think can also be said about this is that as far as I view it, it is not really necessary also to include Armenian within this Balkan Sprachbund. So when we really talk of Balkan Indo-European as such, I'm not really sure that we should also include kind of pre-Armenian within it. I'm not saying that we shall kind of saying that Armenian had no kind of prehistoric context with the ancestors of Greek and Albanian, but I'm not really sure that this context happened in the prehistoric Balkan regions. So for this prehistoric Balkan Sprachbund, probably as far as the most well-known languages are concerned, we should at least narrow it down to Albanian, pre-Albanian and pre-Greek. This would be my intuition, right?
Thank you very much. Now we have a 15 minutes coffee break. At 12:30. 12:30, we are here.